Hi, it's Kristen Rodier again, a professor of philosophy at Athabasca University. I'm the coordinator for Philosophy 252, and in Unit 7, this is kind of the high-level overview of what's covered. It's Chapter 17 in the Dayton and Rodier book, and it's Chapter 4 and Chapter 6 in Calling Bullshit. What we have here is all kind of under the rubric of distorting the facts. The unit is called Science and Causal Reasoning. Essentially, what we have here is getting into some of the nitty-gritty around reasoning using claims from science and trying to evaluate what kind of evidence they are, what kind of claims they provide evidence for, and what would improve the scientific claim, and to be more sort of strict about what is being claimed as a causal connection. So one of the first things we start off with is all these kinds of analogies from science. And what that means is that in order to come up with new ideas in the examples in the textbook, particular scientists have looked at two things being similar and tried that out as a hypothesis, and then found ways in which the analogy did or did not work, and that analogical reasoning helped them move their scientific field forward, but that an analogy is just an analogy. It doesn't actually prove the thing about which we are analogizing to. And so a false analogy is when, in a way, we make more of the analogy than you really should. And that can be by sort of not constraining the analogy to what it really is, which is trying to give us an explanation. And false analogies are those where two things are being compared, but they're not alike in the relevant ways. So when it is a good analogy, they must be alike in the relevant ways. And even then, it's only an analogy. So we need to keep it within the domain that it should be within. Relevant thesis, another way of calling that one is sidetracking or red herring. So that's when, think about a fallacy in the context of a dialogue, right? I'm talking about A, and then you start talking about B. And unless they're logically related, it is just an irrelevant thesis. So which we talk about this in the book, but one of the pulls of the irrelevant thesis is that the thing that you're being sidetracked to might also be good and interesting. It's just not on topic. So it fails, it hurts the realization of the goal of the dialogue. Slippery slope, we really identify that in terms of basically saying, kind of setting up a chain of dominoes where they're all getting worse, and then the final one is so bad that it disproves, let's say, or counts as evidence against even the initial domino. So what happens is there are causal chains, and there are causal chains that we should be worried about initiating, but the fallacy of the slippery slope says X leads to Y, Y leads to Z, Z leads to M, and then we have another Z there. It just keeps going. But essentially you have necessary, terrible consequences. So the argument gives actually no budge for, yeah, it's possible that this thing won't happen. And then this next step in the chain of events, yeah, it's possible that that won't happen. No, it's saying this is definitely what's going to happen, and it's bad. So the fallacies of false cause essentially are, they have a bunch of different kinds of qualities to them, but essentially what they're doing is they're making causal claims without enough evidence. And you can sort of sympathize in a way, because it is actually really difficult to make causal claims, and to prove them sort of beyond a doubt, right? Especially if we say, this is the only cause of that, then it's even more difficult to cause, because there's sort of a lot of causation going on all the time. Which isn't to give up on causal reasoning, but is to say that we need to be specific and measured in our claims. So when we have post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore, because of this, what we're saying is that we have a temporal sequence, and we're saying, well, this came after that, so it must be a causal relationship, where things can actually just follow each other in order without it being a causal relationship. They could be caused by independent things, but they appear one after another. And it is true that causation usually temporally goes from now unto the next now. So there is some force behind it, but it's not enough to establish a cause. So a spurious correlation has a couple of variations of it. The one that I have written here is just assuming A is the cause of C when they could both be caused by B. So that could mean B causes A, which causes C, or B causes C and A independently. Either way, A and C are just correlated, but because they're correlated, they're assumed to be one is the cause of the other. But what's spurious is there's actually something we can point to that we're overlooking, and that is B. So mere correlation, I'm sure many of you have heard the kind of slogan, which is correlation is never necessarily causation. A lot of things can be correlated together. The Bullshit book really shows the ways in which, data and visualizations can be used to show positive correlations between things, and actually establishing a causal mechanism between things that are merely correlated has to, in large part, rely on what kind of thing we're talking about, and whether there are sort of laws of nature that bring those two things together, right? They're not operating at a distance from each other, that there's actually a closeness, there's a connection between how those things are working, and the correlation has to make sense in order for us to be able to investigate whether or not it's causal. And so when we're making claims such as X caused Y, when we're pulling out arguments and identifying a particular conclusion, you really want to look at, and it's not always going to say Joe caused, or let's just say the body heat of these animals caused a thunderstorm or something, which I actually think is it can happen. But anyway, it's often not going to say X caused Y right in the claim. You're going to look for a sentence or two which make that claim, usually using other words. But you want to kind of identify, does it have this form of saying smoking caused cancer or something like that? And at the same time, there's a lot of different strengths or ways that a causal claim can be explained. So one could be the most certain one, which is a necessary, which is X must have caused Y. So like X must be the cause of Y. And a sufficient one would be X could be or X is able to cause Y. That's different than saying X is the only cause of Y. Probabilistic is where you get these claims like smoking causes cancer. What we're really saying is that smoking seriously increases your chance of getting cancer. It's possible that you don't, but it's a serious, as they sort of say, risk factor. And that makes it less certain than must or can. And then positive correlation is even weaker. It sort of just says two things are both happening. they're positively correlated, and that's not nothing, but everything matters around the details of what the mechanism is that connects the two things. And a lot of the bullshit book talks about how scientific studies not only get reported on in the media, but specifically about scientific studies on human beings. And so when you think about it, and I think about this too, whenever I read something that's a study about human beings, I always ask myself, was I in that study? And what would it take to have had me in that study? And then can you analogize from that population to me if I'm thinking about whether or not it applies? So that's just a beginning question. That's not all of our worries. But when we want to ask questions about these kinds of studies, we ask, well, who are they about? And the Bergstrom and West talk about weird populations. So Western, let's see if I can list them all off. Elite, okay, I already made a mistake. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations. Now, what that means is from countries with governments that are, written to be democratic. It's not that, the people in them are somehow selected in a democratic way. And so the example they give is that, okay, who signs up to be in scientific studies? Primarily university students as part of their introductory courses, or maybe there's other field work where people are working in communities. But generally speaking, when you're looking at large groups of people, that's where that information is coming from. There's a lot of history of science discussion around different gendered bodies responding to medications differently. And so if you test a certain medication only on a certain kind of body, it's possible that doesn't actually analogize to other people with different hormonal profiles and so on. So that's something to think about. Who signs up for these studies? Well, I don't know. They talk about it in Bergstrom and West, but again, intro psych students maybe, people who have maybe leisure time, maybe people who are getting paid to be in the study. You have to think about who has the time to participate in these studies, and where they're getting their data from. If the study is one where you have to take on a certain kind of lifestyle and then they track something about you, that's an intervention study. So that means that, you have to be participating, reporting, following up. Like, that is a lot of, that's very time consuming and resource heavy, versus doing sort of after the fact observational studies. So the first one is intervention, where we get a group of people, we get them to do something and see what happens. Observational is, we're taking the data from already observed conditions. And in that case, we don't have control variables, we don't have control groups, we're just looking at trends. And so that's less certain, right? How are the pools of participants selected? Who signs up? We don't take a random cross sections of society. Who stays for the full study period? So that's a real question around messing with the data, because sometimes when things don't work or it goes badly, people drop out and then they're not really able to be included in the results. So we have to think about study duration, participation, and when does the study end? The cutoffs really matter. So there might be important effects at the 1.5 or the 2 year mark, but the study has only got money to study for 1 year. And so we really have to be questioning these things when we see a scientific study. So here's a whole bunch of ways that we're hoping that you can work through the exercises, work through the book and the Bergstrom and West lectures, looking over and trying to think critically about science. We'd like you to pick something with some scientific claims on it and analyze them, and sort of be able to pick that out in your exercises and your quizzes.